Chapter 5 of What Katy Did by Susan Coolidge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. Chapter 5 In the Loft. "I declare," said Miss Pettingill, laying down her work, "if them children don't beat all! What on earth are they going to do now?" Miss Pettingill was sitting in the little room in the back building, which she always had when she came to the Carrs, for a week's mending and making over. She was the dearest, funniest old woman who ever went out sewing by the day. Her face was round, and somehow made you think of a very nice baked apple, it was so crisscrossed and lined by 1,000 good-natured puckers. She was small and wiry, and wore caps and a false front, which was just the color of a dusty Newfoundland dog's back. Her eyes were dim, and she used spectacles, but for all that, she was an excellent worker. Everyone liked Miss Pettingill, though Aunt Izzie did once say that her tongue was hung in the middle. Aunt Izzie made this remark when she was in a temper, and was by no means prepared to have Phil walk up at once and request Miss Pettingill to stick it out, which she obligingly did, while the rest of the children crowded to look. They couldn't see that it was different from other tongues, but Philly persisted in finding something curious about it. There must be, you know, since it was hung in that queer way. Wherever Miss Pettingill went, all sorts of treasures went with her. The children liked to have her come, for it was as good as a fairy story, or the circus, to see her things unpacked. Miss Pettingill was very much afraid of burglars. She lay awake half the night listening for them, and nothing on earth would have persuaded her to go anywhere, leaving behind what she called her plate. This stately word meant 6 old teaspoons, very thin and bright and sharp, and a butter knife, whose handle set forth that it was a testimonial of gratitude for saving the life of Ithuriel Jobson, aged 7, on the occasion of his being attacked with quinsy sore throat. Miss Pettingill was very proud of her knife. It and the spoons traveled about in a little basket which hung on her arm, and was never allowed to be out of her sight, even when the family she was sewing for were the honestest people in the world. Then beside the plate basket, Miss Pettingill never stirred without Tom, her tortoise-shell cat. Tom was a beauty, and knew his power. He ruled Miss Pettingill with a rod of iron, and always sat in the rocking-chair when there was one. It was no matter where she sat, Miss Pettingill told people, but Tom was delicate and must be made comfortable. A big family Bible always came too, and a special red merino pincushion, and some shade pictures of old Mr. and Mrs. Pettingill and Peter Pettingill, who was drowned at sea, and photographs of Mrs. Porter, who used to be Marcia Pettingill, and Mrs. Porter's husband, and all the Porter children. Many little boxes and jars came also, and a long row of phials and bottles, filled with homemade physic and herb teas. Miss Pettingill could not have slept without having them beside her, for, as she said, how did she know that she might not be took sudden with something, and die for want of a little ginger balsam or pennyroyal? The Carr children always made so much noise that it required something unusual to make Miss Pettingill drop her work, as she did now, and fly to the window. In fact, there was a tremendous hubbub, hurrahs from Dorry, stamping of feet, and a great outcry of shrill, glad voices. Looking down, Miss Pettingill saw the whole 6, no, 7, for Cecy was there too, stream out of the woodhouse door, which wasn't a door, but only a tall open arch, and rush noisily across the yard. Katy was at the head, bearing a large black bottle without any cork in it, while the others carried in each hand what seemed to be a cookie. "Catherine Carr! Catherine!" screamed Miss Pettingill, tapping loudly on the glass. "Don't you see that it's raining? You ought to be ashamed to let your little brothers and sisters go out and get wet in such a way." But nobody heard her, and the children vanished into the shed, where nothing could be seen but a distant flapping of pantalettes and frilled trousers, going up what seemed to be a ladder, farther back in the shed. So with a dissatisfied cluck Miss Pettingill drew back her head, perched the spectacles on her nose, and went to work again on Katy's plaid alpaca, which had 2 immense zigzag rents across the middle of the front breadth. Katy's frocks, strange to say, always tore exactly in that place. If Miss Pettingill's eyes could have reached a little farther, they would have seen that it wasn't a ladder up which the children were climbing, but a tall wooden post with spikes driven into it about a foot apart. It required quite a stride to get from one spike to the other. In fact, the littler ones couldn't have managed it at all, had it not been for Clover and Cecy boosting very hard from below, while Katy, making a long arm, clawed from above. At last they were all safely up and in the delightful retreat which I am about to describe. Imagine a low, dark loft without any windows, and with only a very little light coming in through the square hole in the floor to which the spiky post led. There was a strong smell of corn cobs, though the corn had been taken away, a great deal of dust and spider web in the corners, and some wet spots on the boards, for the roof always leaked a little in rainy weather. This was the place which, for some reason I have never been able to find out, the Carr children preferred to any other on rainy Saturdays, when they could not play outdoors. Aunt Izzie was as much puzzled at this fancy as I am. When she was young, a vague, far-off time which none of her nieces and nephews believed in much, she had never had any of these queer notions about getting off into holes and corners and poke-away places. Aunt Izzie would gladly have forbidden them to go to the loft, but Dr. Carr had given his permission, so all she could do was to invent stories about children who had broken their bones in various dreadful ways by climbing posts and ladders. But these stories made no impression on any of the children except little Phil, and the self-willed brood kept on their way and climbed their spiked post as often as they liked. "What's in the bottle?" demanded Dorry the minute he was fairly landed in the loft. "Don't be greedy," replied Katy severely. "You will know when the time comes. It is something delicious, I can assure you. Now," she went on, having thus quenched Dorry, "all of you had better give me your cookies to put away. If you don't, they'll be sure to be eaten up before the feast, and then you know there wouldn't be anything to make a feast of." So all of them handed over their cookies. Dorry, who had begun on his as he came up the ladder, was a little unwilling, but he was too much in the habit of minding Katy to dare to disobey. The big bottle was set in a corner, and a stack of cookies built up around it. "That's right," proceeded Katy, who as oldest and biggest always took the lead in their plays. "Now, if we're fixed and ready to begin, the feat," Katy pronounced it feat, "can commence. The opening exercise will be A Tragedy of the Alhambra by Miss Hall." "No," cried Clover. "First the Blue Wizard, or Edwitha of the Hebrides, you know, Katy." "Didn't I tell you?" said Katy. "A dreadful accident has happened to that." "Oh, what?" cried all the rest, for Edwitha was rather a favorite with the family. It was one of the many serial stories which Katy was forever writing, and was about a lady, a knight, a blue wizard, and a poodle named Bop. It had been going on so many months now that everybody had forgotten the beginning, and nobody had any particular hope of living to hear the end, but still the news of its untimely fate was a shock. "I'll tell you," said Katy. "Old Judge Kirby called this morning to see Aunt Izzie. I was studying in the little room, but I saw him come in and pull out the big chair and sit down, and I almost screamed out, 'Don't!'" "Why?" cried the children. "Don't you see? I had stuffed Edwitha down between the back and the seat. It was a beautiful hiding place, for the seat goes back ever so far, but Edwitha was such a fat bundle, and old Judge Kirby takes up so much room, that I was afraid there would be trouble. And sure enough, he had hardly dropped down before there was a great crackling of paper, and he jumped up again and called out, 'Bless me, what is that?' And he began poking and poking, and just as he had poked out the whole bundle and was putting on his spectacles to see what it was, Aunt Izzie came in." "Well, what next?" cried the children, immensely tickled. "Oh," continued Katy, "Aunt Izzie put on her glasses too and screwed up her eyes, you know the way she does, and she and the judge read a little bit of it, that part at the first, you remember, where Bop steals the blue pills and the wizard tries to throw him into the sea. You can't think how funny it was to hear Aunt Izzie reading Edwitha out loud. And Katy went into convulsions at the recollection, where she got to, 'Oh, Bop, my angel Bop!' I just rolled under the table and stuffed the table cover in my mouth to keep from screaming right out. By and by I heard her call Debbie and give her the papers and say, 'Here is a mass of trash which I wish you to put at once into the kitchen fire.' And she told me afterward that she thought I would be in an insane asylum before I was 20. It was too bad," ended Katy, half laughing and half crying, "to burn up the new chapter and all. But there's one good thing. She didn't find the Fairy of the Dry Goods box. That was stuffed farther back in the seat." "And now," continued the mistress of ceremonies, "we will begin. Miss Hall will please rise." Miss Hall, much flustered at her fine name, got up with very red cheeks. "It was once upon a time," she read, "moonlight lay on the halls of the Alhambra, and the night, striding impatiently down the passage, thought she would never come." "Who, the moon?" asked Clover. "No, of course not," replied Cecy. "A lady he was in love with. The next verse is going to tell about her, only you interrupted. She wore a turban of silver with a jeweled crescent. As she stole down the corregidor, the beams struck it, and it glittered like stars." "So you are come, Zuleika?" "Yes, my lord." Just then a sound as of steel smote upon the ear, and Zuleika's mail-clad father rushed in. He drew his sword, so did the other. A moment more, and they both lay dead and stiff in the beams of the moon. Zuleika gave a loud shriek and threw herself upon their bodies. She was dead too. And so ends the tragedy of the Alhambra. "That's lovely," said Katy, drawing a long breath. "Only very sad. What beautiful stories you do write, Cecy. But I wish you wouldn't always kill the people. Why couldn't the knight have killed the father and— No, I suppose Zuleika wouldn't have married him then. Well, the father might have— Oh, bother! Why must anybody be killed, anyhow? Why not have them fall on each other's necks and make up?" "Why, Katy," cried Cecy, "it wouldn't have been a tragedy then. You know the name was a tragedy of the Alhambra." "Oh, well," said Katy hurriedly, for Cecy's lips were beginning to pout, and her fair pinkish face to redden as if she were about to cry. "Perhaps it was prettier to have them all die. Only I thought, for a change, you know. What a lovely word that was. Corregidor. What does it mean?" "I don't know," replied Cecy, quite consoled. "It was in the Conquest of Grenada. Something to walk over, I believe." "The next," went on Katy, consulting her paper, "is Yap, a simple poem by Clover Carr." All the children giggled, but Clover got up composedly and recited the following verses. "Did you ever know Yap, the best little dog who e'er sat on a lap or barked at a frog? His eyes were like beads, his tail like a mop, and it wiggled as if it never would stop. His hair was like silk of the glossiest sheen, he always ate milk, and once the cold cream, off the nursery bureau, that line is too long, it made him quite ill, so endeth my song, for Yappy he died just 2 months ago, and we oughtn't to sing at a funeral, you know." The poem met with immense applause. All the children laughed and shouted and clapped, till the loft rang again. But Clover kept her face perfectly, and sat down as demure as ever, except that the little dimples came and went at the corners of her mouth. Dimples partly natural and partly, I regret to say, the result of a pointed slate pencil with which Clover was in the habit of deepening them every day while she studied her lessons. "Now," said Katy, after the noise had subsided, "now come Scripture verses by Miss Elsie and Joanna Carr. Hold up your head, Elsie, and speak distinctly. Oh, and Johnny, you mustn't giggle in that way when it comes your turn." But Johnny only giggled the harder at this appeal, keeping her hands very tight across her mouth and peeping out over her fingers. Elsie, however, was solemn as a little judge, and with great dignity began, "An angel with a fiery sword came to send Adam and Eve abroad, and as they journeyed through the skies they took one look at paradise. They thought of all the happy hours among the birds and fragrant bowers, and Eve she wept, and Adam bawled, and both together loudly squalled." Dorry snickered at this, but sedate Clover hushed him. "You mustn't," she said. "It's about the Bible, you know. Now, John, it's your turn." But Johnny would persist in holding her hands over her mouth, while her fat little shoulders shook with laughter. At last, with a great effort, she pulled her face straight, and speaking as fast as she possibly could, repeated in a sort of burst, "Balaam's donkey saw the angel and stopped short in fear. Balaam didn't see the angel, which is very queer." After which she took refuge again behind her fingers, while Elsie went on. "Elijah by the creek, he by ravens fed, took from their horny beak pieces of meat and bread." "Come, Johnny," said Katy, but the incorrigible Johnny was shaking again, and all they could make out was, "The bears came down and ate." These verses were part of a grand project on which Clover and Elsie had been busy for more than a year. It was a sort of rearrangement of scripture for infant minds, and when it was finished they meant to have it published, bound in red with daguerreotypes of the two authoresses on the cover. The Youth's Poetical Bible was to be the name of it. Papa, much tickled with the scraps which he overheard, proposed instead the Trundlebed Book, as having been composed principally in that spot. But Elsie and Clover were highly indignant, and would not listen to the idea for a moment. After the scripture verses came Dorry's turn. He had been allowed to choose for himself, which was unlucky, as his taste was peculiar, not to say gloomy. On this occasion he had selected that cheerful hymn which begins, "Hark from the tombs a doleful sound," and now he began to recite it in a lugubrious voice, and with great emphasis, smacking his lips, as it were, over such lines as, "Princes, this clay shall be your bed, in spite of all your towers." The older children listened with a sort of fascinated horror, rather enjoying the cold chills which ran down their backs, and huddling close together, as Dorry's hollow tones echoed from the dark corners of the loft. It was too much for Philly, however. At the close of the piece he was found to be in tears. "I don't want to stay up here and be groaned at," he sobbed. "There, you bad boy," cried Katy, all the more angry because she was conscious of having enjoyed it herself. "That's what you do with your horrid hymns, frightening us to death and making Phil cry." And she gave Dorry a little shake. He began to whimper, and as Phil was still sobbing, and Johnny had begun to sob too, out of sympathy with the others, the feat in the loft seemed likely to come to a sad end. "I'm going to tell Aunt Izzie that I don't like you," declared Dorry, putting one leg through the opening in the floor. "No, you aren't," said Katy, seizing him. "You are going to stay because now we are going to have the feast. Do stop, Phil, and Johnny, don't be a goose, but come and pass around the cookies." The word feast produced a speedy effect on the spirits of the party. Phil cheered at once, and Dorry changed his mind about going. The black bottle was solemnly set in the midst, and the cookies were handed about by Johnny, who was now all smiles. The cookies had scalloped edges and caraway seeds inside, and were very nice. There were 2 apiece, and as the last was finished, Katy put her hand in her pocket, and amid great applause produced the crowning addition to the repast, 7 long brown sticks of cinnamon. "Isn't it fun?" she said. "Debbie was real good-natured today, and let me put my own hand into the box, so I picked out the longest sticks there were. Now, Cecy, as your company, you shall have the first drink out of the bottle." The something delicious proved to be weak vinegar and water. It was quite warm, but somehow, drunk up there in the loft and out of a bottle, it tasted very nice. Besides, they didn't call it vinegar and water, of course not. Each child gave his or her swallow a different name, as if the bottle were like Signor Blitz's and could pour out a dozen things at once. Clover called her share raspberry shrub. Dorry christened his ginger pop, while Cecy, who was romantic, took her 3 sips under the name of hydamel, which she explained was something nice made, she believed, of beeswax. The last drop gone, and the last bit of cinnamon crunched, the company came to order again, for the purpose of hearing Philly repeat his one piece, Little Drops of Water, which exciting poem he had said every Saturday as far back as they could remember. After that, Katy declared the literary part of the feat over, and they all fell to playing stagecoach, which, in spite of close quarters and an occasional bump from the roof, was such good fun that a general "Oh, dear" welcomed the ringing of the tea-bell. I suppose cookies and vinegar had taken away their appetites, for none of them were hungry, and Dorry astonished Aunt Izzie very much by eyeing the table in a disgusted way and saying, "Pshaw! Only plum sweetmeats and sponge cake and hot biscuit. I don't want any supper." "What ails the child? He must be sick," said Dr. Carr, but Katy explained. "Oh, no, Papa, it isn't that, only we've been having a feast in the loft." "Did you have a good time?" asked Papa, while Aunt Izzie gave a dissatisfied groan, and all the children answered at once, "Splendiferous." End of chapter 5. 6 of What Katy Did by Susan Coolidge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. Chapter 6. Intimate Friends. "Aunt Izzie, may I ask Imogen Clarke to spend the day here on Saturday?" cried Katy, bursting in one afternoon. "Who on earth is Imogen Clarke? I never heard the name before," replied her aunt. "Oh, the loveliest girl. She hasn't been going to Mrs. Knight's school but a little while, but we're the greatest friends. And she's perfectly beautiful, Aunt Izzie. Her hands are just as white as snow, and no bigger than that. She's got the littlest waist of any girl in school, and she's real sweet, and so self-denying and unselfish. I don't believe she has a bit of good times at home either. Do let me ask her." "How do you know she's so sweet and self-denying if you've known her such a short time?" asked Aunt Izzie in an unpromising tone. "Oh, she tells me everything. We always walk together at recess now. I know all about her, and she's just lovely. Her father used to be real rich, but they're poor now, and Imogen had to have her boots patched twice last winter. I guess she's the flower of her family. You can't think how I love her," concluded Katy sentimentally. "No, I can't," said Aunt Izzie. "I never could see into these sudden friendships of yours, Katy, and I'd rather you wouldn't invite this Imogen, or whatever her name is, till I've had a chance to ask somebody about her." Katy clasped her hands in despair. "Oh, Aunt Izzie," she cried, "Imogen knows that I came in to ask you, and she's standing at the gate this moment, waiting to hear what you say. Please let me, just this once. I shall be so dreadfully ashamed not to." "Well," said Aunt Izzie, moved by the wretchedness of Katy's face, "if you've asked her already, it's no use my saying no, I suppose. But recollect, Katy, this is not to happen again. I can't have you inviting girls and then coming for my leave. Your father won't be at all pleased. He's very particular about whom you make friends with. Remember how Mrs. Spencer turned out." Poor Katy! Her propensity to fall violently in love with new people was always getting her into scrapes. Ever since she began to walk and talk, Katy's intimate friends had been one of the jokes of the household. Papa once undertook to keep a list of them, but the number grew so great that he gave it up in despair. First on the list was a small Irish child named Mary Ann O'Reilly. Mary Ann lived in a street which Katy passed on her way to school. It was not Mrs. Knight's, but an ABC school, to which Dorry and John now went. Mary Ann used to be always making sand pies in front of her mother's house, and Katy, who was about 5 years old, often stopped to help her. Over this mutual pastry they grew so intimate that Katy resolved to adopt Mary Ann as her own little girl, and bring her up in a safe and hidden corner. She told Clover of this plan, but nobody else. The two children, full of their delightful secret, began to save pieces of bread and cookies from their supper every evening. By degrees they collected a great heap of dry crusts and other refreshments, which they put safely away in the garret. They also saved the apples which were given them for 2 weeks, and made a bed in a big empty box with cotton quilts and the dolls' pillows out of the baby house. When all was ready, Katy broke the plan to her beloved Mary Ann, and easily persuaded her to run away and take possession of this new home. "We won't tell Papa and Mamma until she's quite grown up," Katy said to Clover. "Then we'll bring her downstairs, and won't they be surprised! Don't let's call her Mary Ann any longer either. It isn't pretty. We'll name her Susquehanna instead. Susquehanna Carr. Recollect, Mary Ann, you mustn't answer if I call you Mary Ann, only when I say Susquehanna." "Yes'm," replied Mary Ann very meekly. For a whole day all went on delightfully. Susquehanna lived in her wooden box, ate all the apples and the freshest cookies, and was happy. The two children took turns to steal away and play with the baby, as they called Mary Ann, though she was a great deal bigger than Clover. But when night came on, and nurse swooped on Katy and Clover and carried them off to bed, Miss O'Reilly began to think that the garret was a dreadful place. Peeping out of her box, she could see black things standing in corners, which she did not recollect seeing in the daytime. They were really trunks and brooms and warming pans, but somehow in the darkness they looked different, big and awful. Poor little Mary Ann bore it as long as she could, but when at last a rat began to scratch in the wall close beside her, her courage gave way entirely, and she screamed at the top of her voice. "What is that?" said Dr. Carr, who had just come in and was on his way upstairs. "It sounds as if it came from the attic," said Mrs. Carr, for this was before Mamma died. "Can it be that one of the children has got out of bed and wandered upstairs in her sleep?" No, Katy and Clover were safe in the nursery. So Dr. Carr took a candle and went as fast as he could to the attic, where the yells were growing terrific. When he reached the top of the stairs, the cries ceased. He looked about. Nothing was to be seen at first. Then a little head appeared over the edge of a big wooden box, and a piteous voice sobbed out, "Oh, Miss Katy, and indeed I can't be staying any longer. There's rats in it." "Who on earth are you?" asked the amazed doctor. "Sure, I'm Miss Katy's and Miss Clover's baby. But I don't want to be a baby any longer. I want to go home and see my mother." And again the poor little midge lifted up her voice and wept. I don't think Dr. Carr ever laughed so hard in his life as when finally he got to the bottom of the story and found that Katy and Clover had been adopting a child. But he was very kind to poor Susquehanna and carried her downstairs in his arms to the nursery. There, in a bed close to the other children, she soon forgot her troubles and fell asleep. The little sisters were much surprised when they waked up in the morning and found their baby asleep beside them. But their joy was speedily turned to tears. After breakfast, Dr. Carr carried Mary Ann home to her mother, who was in a great fright over her disappearance, and explained to the children that the garret plan must be given up. Great was the mourning in the nursery, but as Mary Ann was allowed to come and play with them now and then, they gradually got over their grief. A few months later Mr. O'Reilly moved away from Burnett, and that was the end of Katy's first friendship. The next was even funnier. There was a queer old black woman who lived all alone by herself in a small house near the school. This old woman had a very bad temper. The neighbors told horrible stories about her, so that the children were afraid to pass the house. They used to turn always just before they reached it and cross to the other side of the street. This they did so regularly that their feet had worn a path in the grass. But for some reason Katy found a great fascination in the little house. She liked to dodge about the door, always holding herself ready to turn and run in case the old woman rushed out upon her with a broomstick. One day she begged a large cabbage of Alexander and rolled it in at the door of the house. The old woman seemed to like it, and after this Katy always stopped to speak when she went by. She even got so far as to sit on the step and watch the old woman at work. There was a sort of perilous pleasure in doing this. It was like sitting at the entrance of a lion's cage, uncertain at what moment His Majesty might take it into his head to give a spring and eat you up. After this, Katy took a fancy to a couple of twin sisters, daughters of a German jeweler. They were quite grown up, and always wore dresses exactly alike. Hardly anyone could tell them apart. They spoke very little English, and as Katy didn't know a word of German, their intercourse was confined to smiles and to the giving of bunches of flowers, which Katy used to tie up and present to them whenever they passed the gate. She was too shy to do more than just put the flowers in their hands and run away, but the twins were evidently pleased, for one day, when Clover happened to be looking out of the window, she saw them open the gate, fasten a little parcel to a bush, and walk rapidly off. Of course she called Katy at once, and the two children flew out to see what the parcel was. It held a bonnet, a beautiful doll's bonnet of blue silk, trimmed with artificial flowers, upon which was pinned a slip of paper with these words, in an odd foreign hand: "To the nice little girl who was so kindly to give us some flowers." You can judge whether Katy and Clover were pleased or not. This was when Katy was 6 years old. I can't begin to tell you how many different friends she had set up since then. There was an ashman and a steamboat captain. There was Mrs. Sawyer's cook, a nice old woman who gave Katy lessons in cooking and taught her to make soft custard and sponge cake. There was a bonnet maker, pretty and dressy, whom, to Aunt Izzie's great indignation, Katy persisted in calling Cousin Estelle. There was a thief in the town jail, under whose window Katy used to stand saying, "I'm so sorry, poor man," and "Have you got any little girls like me?" in the most piteous way. The thief had a piece of string which he let down from the window. Katy would tie rosebuds and cherries to this string, and the thief would draw them up. It was so interesting to do this that Katy felt dreadfully when they carried the man off to the state prison. Then followed a short interval of Cornelia Perham, a nice, good-natured girl whose father was a fruit merchant. I am afraid Katy's liking for prunes and white grapes played a part in this intimacy. It was splendid fun to go with Cornelia to her father's big shop and have whole boxes of raisins and drums of figs opened for their amusement, and be allowed to ride up and down in the elevator as much as they liked. But of all Katy's queer acquaintances, Mrs. Spencer, to whom Aunt Izzie had alluded, was the queerest. Mrs. Spencer was a mysterious lady whom nobody ever saw. Her husband was a handsome, rather bad-looking man who had come from parts unknown and rented a small house in Burnet. He didn't seem to have any particular business and was away from home a great deal. His wife was said to be an invalid, and people, when they spoke of him, shook their heads and wondered how the poor woman got on all alone in the house while her husband was absent. Of course, Katy was too young to understand these whispers, or the reasons why people were not disposed to think well of Mr. Spencer. The romance of the closed door and the lady whom nobody saw interested her very much. She used to stop and stare at the windows and wonder what was going on inside, till at last it seemed as if she must know. So one day she took some flowers and Victoria, her favorite doll, and boldly marched into the Spencers' yard. She tapped at the front door, but nobody answered. Then she tapped again. Still nobody answered. She tried the door. It was locked. So, shouldering Victoria, she trudged round to the back of the house. As she passed the side door, she saw that it was open a little way. She knocked for the third time, and as no one came, she went in, and passing through the little hall, began to tap at all the inside doors. There seemed to be no people in the house. Katy peeped into the kitchen first. It was bare and forlorn. All sorts of dishes were standing about. There was no fire in the stove. The parlor was not much better. Mr. Spencer's boots lay in the middle of the floor. There were dirty glasses on the table. On the mantelpiece was a platter with bones of meat upon it. Dust lay thick over everything, and the whole house looked as if it hadn't been lived in for at least a year. Katy tried several other doors, all of which were locked, and then she went upstairs. As she stood on the top step, grasping her flowers, and a little doubtful what to do next, a feeble voice from a bedroom called out, "Who is there?" This was Mrs. Spencer. She was lying on her bed, which was very tossed and tumbled, as if it hadn't been made up that morning. The room was as disorderly and dirty as all the rest of the house, and Mrs. Spencer's wrapper and nightcap were by no means clean, but her face was sweet, and she had beautiful curling hair which fell over the pillow. She was evidently very sick, and altogether Katy felt sorrier for her than she had ever done for anybody in her life. "Who are you, child?" asked Mrs. Spencer. "I'm Dr. Carr's little girl," answered Katy, going straight up to the bed. "I came to bring you some flowers," and she laid the bouquet on the dirty sheet. Mrs. Spencer seemed to like the flowers. She took them up and smelled them for a long time without speaking. "But how did you get in?" she said at last. "The door was open," faltered Katy, who was beginning to feel scared at her own daring. "And they said you were sick, so I thought perhaps you would like me to come and see you." "You are a kind little girl," said Mrs. Spencer, and gave her a kiss. After this, Katy used to go every day. Sometimes Mrs. Spencer would be up and moving feebly about, but more often she was in bed, and Katy would sit beside her. The house never looked a bit better than it did that first day, but after a while Katy used to brush Mrs. Spencer's hair and wash her face with the corner of a towel. I think her visits were a comfort to the poor lady, who was very ill and lonely. Sometimes, when she felt pretty well, she would tell Katy stories about the time when she was a little girl and lived at home with her father and mother. But she never spoke of Mr. Spencer, and Katy never saw him except once, when she was so frightened that for several days she dared not go near the house. At last Cecy reported that she had seen him go off in the stage with his carpet-bag, so Katy ventured in again. Mrs. Spencer cried when she saw her. "I thought you were never coming any more," she said. Katy was touched and flattered at having been missed, and after that she never lost a day. She always carried the prettiest flowers she could find, and if anyone gave her a specially nice peach or a bunch of grapes, she saved it for Mrs. Spencer. Aunt Izzie was much worried at all this, but Dr. Carr would not interfere. He said it was a case where grown people could do nothing, and if Katy was a comfort to the poor lady he was glad. Katy was glad too, and the visits did her as much good as they did Mrs. Spencer, for the intense pity she felt for the sick woman made her gentle and patient as she had never been before. One day she stopped as usual on her way home from school. She tried the side door. It was locked. The back door. It was locked too. All the blinds were shut tight. This was very puzzling. As she stood in the yard, a woman put her head out the window of the next house. "It's no use knocking," she said. "All the folks have gone away." "Gone away where?" asked Katy. "Nobody knows," said the woman. "The gentleman came back in the middle of the night, and this morning before light he had a wagon at the door, and just put in the trunks and the sick lady and drove off. There's been more than one a-knocking besides you since then, but Mr. Pudgett, he's got the key, and nobody can get in without going to him." It was too true. Mrs. Spencer was gone, and Katy never saw her again. In a few days it came out that Mr. Spencer was a very bad man, and had been making false money, counterfeiting, as grown people call it. The police were searching for him to put him in jail, and that was the reason he had come back in such a hurry and carried off his poor sick wife. Aunt Izzie cried with mortification when she heard this. She said she thought it was a disgrace that Katy should have been visiting in a counterfeiter's family, but Dr. Carr only laughed. He told Aunt Izzie that he didn't think that kind of crime was catching, and as for Mrs. Spencer, she was much to be pitied. But Aunt Izzie could not get over her vexation, and every now and then, when she was vexed, she would refer to the affair, though this all happened so long ago that most people had forgotten all about it, and Philly and John had stopped playing at putting Mr. Spencer in jail, which for a long time was one of their favorite games. Katy always felt badly when Aunt Izzie spoke unkindly of her poor sick friend. She had tears in her eyes now, as she walked to the gate, and looked so very sober that Imogen Clarke, who stood there waiting, clasped her hands and said, "Ah, I see. Your aristocratic aunt refuses." Imogen's real name was Elizabeth. She was rather a pretty girl, with a screwed-up, sentimental mouth, shiny brown hair, and a little round curl on each of her cheeks. These curls must have been fastened on with glue or tin tacks, one would think, for they never moved, however much she laughed or shook her head. Imogen was a bright girl, naturally, but she had read so many novels that her brain was completely turned. It was partly this which made her so attractive to Katy, who adored stories and thought Imogen was a real heroine of romance. "Oh, no, she doesn't," she replied, hardly able to keep from laughing at the idea of Aunt Izzie's being called an aristocratic relative. "She says she shall be my But here Katy's conscience gave a prick, and the sentence ended in "So you'll come, won't you, darling? I'm so glad." "And I," said Imogen, turning up her eyes theatrically. From this time on till the end of the week the children talked of nothing but Imogen's visit and the nice time they were going to have. Before breakfast on Saturday morning, Katy and Clover were at work building a beautiful bower of asparagus boughs under the trees. All the playthings were set out in order. Debbie baked them some cinnamon cakes, the kitten had a pink ribbon tied round her neck, and the dolls, including Pickery, were arrayed in their best clothes. At about 10:30 Imogen arrived. She was dressed in a light blue barège with low neck and short sleeves, and wore coral beads in her hair, white satin slippers, and a pair of yellow gloves. The gloves and slippers were quite dirty, and the barège was old and darned, but the general effect was so very gorgeous that the children, who were dressed for play, in gingham frocks and white aprons, were quite dazzled at the appearance of their guest. "Oh, Imogen, you'd look just like a young lady in a story," said simple Katy, whereupon Imogen tossed her head and rustled her skirts about more than ever. Somehow, with these fine clothes, Imogen seemed to have put on a fine manner, quite different from the one she used every day. You know some people always do when they go out visiting. You would almost have supposed that this was a different Imogen, who was kept in a box most of the time and taken out for Sundays and grand occasions. She swam about and diddled and lisped and looked at herself in the glass, and was generally grown up and airy. When Aunt Izzie spoke to her, she fluttered and behaved so queerly that Clover almost laughed. And even Katy, who could see nothing wrong in people she loved, was glad to carry her away to the playroom. "Come out to the bower," she said, putting her arm around the blue barège waist. "A bower!" cried Imogen. "How sweet!" But when they reached the asparagus boughs, her face fell. "Why, it hasn't any roof or pinnacles or any fountain," she said. "Why, no, of course not," said Clover, staring. "We made it ourselves." "Oh," said Imogen. She was evidently disappointed. Katy and Clover felt mortified, but as their visitor did not care for the bower, they tried to think of something else. "Let us go to the loft," they said. So they all crossed the yard together. Imogen picked her way daintily in the white satin slippers, but when she saw the spiked post she gave a scream. "Oh, not up there, darling, not up there!" she cried. "Never, never!" "Oh, do try. It's just as easy as can be," pleaded Katy, going up and down half a dozen times in succession to show how easy it was. But Imogen wouldn't be persuaded. "Do not ask me," she said affectedly. "My nerves would never stand such a thing. And besides, my dress." "What made you wear it?" said Philly, who was a plain-spoken child and given to questions. While John whispered to Dorry, "That's a real stupid girl. Let's go off somewhere and play by ourselves." So one by one the small fry crept away, leaving Katy and Clover to entertain the visitor by themselves. They tried dolls, but Imogen did not care for dolls. Then they proposed to sit down in the shade and cap verses, a game they all liked. But Imogen said that though she adored poetry she never could remember any. So it ended in their going to the orchard, where Imogen ate a great many plums and early apples and really seemed to enjoy herself. But when she could eat no more, a dreadful dullness fell over the party. At last Imogen said, "Don't you ever sit in the drawing-room?" "The what?" asked Clover. "The drawing-room," repeated Imogen. "Oh, she means the parlor," cried Katy. "No, we don't sit there except when Aunt Izzie has company to tea. It's all dark and poky, you know. Beside, it's so much pleasanter to be outdoors. Don't you think so?" "Yes, sometimes," replied Imogen doubtfully. "But I think it would be pleasant to go in and sit there a while now. My head aches dreadfully being out here in this horrid sun." Katy was at her wits' end to know what to do. They scarcely ever went into the parlor, which Aunt Izzie regarded as a sort of sacred place. She kept cotton petticoats over all the chairs for fear of dust, and never opened the blinds for fear of flies. The idea of children with dusty boots going in there to sit! On the other hand, Katy's natural politeness made it hard to refuse a visitor anything she asked for. And besides, it was dreadful to think that Imogen might go away and report, "Katy Carr isn't allowed to sit in the best room even when she has company." With a quaking heart she led the way to the parlor. She dared not open the blinds, so the room looked very dark. She could just see Imogen's figure as she sat on the sofa, and Clover twirling uneasily about on the piano stool. All the time she kept listening to hear if Aunt Izzie were not coming, and altogether the parlor was a dismal place to her, not half so pleasant as the asparagus bower, where they felt perfectly safe. But Imogen, who for the first time seemed comfortable, began to talk. Her talk was about herself. Such stories she told about the things which had happened to her. All the young ladies in the Ledger put together never had stranger adventures. Gradually Katy and Clover got so interested that they left their seats and crouched down close to the sofa, listening with open mouths to these stories. Katy forgot to listen for Aunt Izzie. The parlor door swung open, but she did not notice it. She did not even hear the front door shut when Papa came home to dinner. Dr. Carr, stopping in the hall to glance over his newspaper, heard the high-pitched voice running on in the parlor. At first he hardly listened, then these words caught his ear. "Oh, it was lovely, girls, perfectly delicious. I suppose I did look well, for I was all in white, with my hair let down, and just one rose, you know, here on top. And he leaned over me and said in a low, deep tone, 'Lady, I am a brigand, but I feel the enchanting power of your beauty. You are free.'" Dr. Carr pushed the door open a little further. Nothing was to be seen but some indistinct figures, but he heard Katy's voice in an eager tone. "Oh, do go on. What happened next?" "Who on earth have the children got in the parlor?" he asked Aunt Izzie, whom he found in the dining room. "The parlor!" cried Miss Izzie wrathfully. "Why, what are they there for?" Then going to the door she called out, "Children, what are you doing in the parlor? Come out right away. I thought you were playing outdoors." "Imogen had a headache," faltered Katy. The three girls came out into the hall, Clover and Katy looking scared, and even the enchanter of the Brigand quite crestfallen. "Oh," said Aunt Izzie grimly, "I am sorry to hear that. Probably you are bilious. Would you like some camphor or anything?" "No, thank you," replied Imogen meekly, but afterwards she whispered to Katy, "Your aunt isn't very nice, I think. She's just like Jacama, that horrid old woman I told you about who lived in the Brigand's Cave and did the cooking." "I don't think you're a bit polite to tell me so," retorted Katy, very angry at this speech. "Oh, never mind, dear. Don't take it to heart," replied Imogen sweetly. "We can't help having relations that ain't nice, you know." The visit was evidently not a success. Papa was very civil to Imogen at dinner, but he watched her closely. Katy saw a comical twinkle in his eye which she did not like. Papa had very droll eyes. They saw everything, and sometimes they seemed to talk almost as distinctly as his tongue. Katy began to feel low-spirited. She confessed afterward that she should never have got through the afternoon if she hadn't run upstairs 2 or 3 times and comforted herself by reading a little in Rosamond. "Aren't you glad she's gone?" whispered Clover as they stood at the gate together watching Imogen walk down the street. "Oh, Clover, how can you?" said Katy, but she gave Clover a great hug, and I think in her heart she was glad. "Katy," said Papa next day, "you came into the room then exactly like your new friend Miss Clarke." "How? I don't know what you mean," answered Katy, blushing deeply. "So," said Dr. Carr, and he got up, raising his shoulders and squaring his elbows, and took a few mincing steps across the room. Katy couldn't help laughing, it was so funny and so like Imogen. Then Papa sat down again and drew her close to him. "My dear," he said, "you're an affectionate child, and I'm glad of it. But there is such a thing as throwing away one's affection. I didn't fancy that little girl at all yesterday. What makes you like her so much?" "I didn't like her so much yesterday," admitted Katy reluctantly. "She's a great deal nicer than that at school sometimes." "I'm glad to hear it," said her father, "for I should be sorry to think that you really admired such silly manners. And what was that nonsense I heard her telling you about brigands?" "It really began Katy. Then she caught Papa's eye and bit her lip, for he looked very quizzical. "Well," she went on laughing, "I suppose it didn't really all happen. But it was ever so funny, Papa, even if it was a make-up. And Imogen's just as good-natured as can be. All the girls like her." "Make-ups are all very well," said Papa, "as long as people don't try to make you believe they are true. When they do that, it seems to me it comes too near the edge of falsehood to be very safe or pleasant. If I were you, Katy, I'd be a little shy of swearing eternal friendship for Miss Clarke. She may be good-natured, as you say, but I think 2 or 3 years hence she won't seem so nice to you as she does now. Give me a kiss, chick, and run away, for there's Alexander with the buggy." End of chapter 6. Seven of What Katy Did by Susan Coolidge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. Chapter 7. Cousin Helen's Visit. A little knot of the schoolgirls were walking home together one afternoon in July. As they neared Dr. Carr's gate, Maria Fiske exclaimed at the sight of a pretty bunch of flowers lying in the middle of the sidewalk. "Oh, my!" she cried. "See what somebody's dropped. I'm going to have it." She stooped to pick it up, but just as her fingers touched the stems, the nosegay, as if bewitched, began to move. Maria made a bewildered clutch. The nosegay moved faster and at last vanished under the gate, while a giggle sounded from the other side of the hedge. "Did you see that?" shrieked Maria. "Those flowers ran away by themselves." "Nonsense," said Katy. "It's those absurd children." Then, opening the gate, she called, "John, Dorry, come out and show yourselves." But nobody replied, and no one could be seen. The nosegay lay on the path, however, and picking it up, Katy exhibited to the girls a long end of black thread tied to the stems. "That's a very favorite trick of Johnny's," she said. "She and Dorry are always tying up flowers and putting them on the walk to tease people. Here, Maria, take 'em if you like, though I don't think John's taste in bouquets is very good." "Isn't it splendid to have vacation come?" said one of the bigger girls. "What are you all going to do? We're going to the seaside." "Pa says he'll take Susie and me to Niagara," said Maria. "I'm going to make my aunt a visit," said Alice Blair. "She lives in a real lovely place in the country. There's a pond there. And Tom, that's my cousin, says he'll teach me to row. What are you going to do, Katy?" "Oh, I don't know. Play around and have splendid times," replied Katy, throwing her bag of books into the air and catching it again. But the other girls looked as if they didn't think this good fun at all, and as if they were sorry for her, and Katy felt suddenly that her vacation wasn't going to be so pleasant as that of the rest. "I wish Papa would take us somewhere," she said to Clover as they walked up the gravel path. "All the other girls' papas do." "He's too busy," replied Clover. "Beside, I don't think any of the rest of the girls have half such good times as we. Ellen Robin says she'd give $1,000,000 for such nice brothers and sisters as ours to play with. And you know, Maria and Susie have awful times at home, though they do go to places. Mrs. Fiske is so particular. She always says don't, and they haven't got any yard to their house or anything. I wouldn't change." "Nor I," said Katy, cheering up at these words of wisdom. "Oh, isn't it lovely to think there won't be any school tomorrow? Vacations are just splendid," and she gave her bag another toss. It fell to the ground with a crash. "There, you've cracked your slate," said Clover. "No matter, I shan't want it again for 8 weeks," replied Katy comfortably, as they ran up the steps. They burst open the front door and raced upstairs, crying, "Hurrah! Hurrah! Vacation's begun! Aunt Izzie, vacation's begun!" Then they stopped short, for lo, the upper hall was all in confusion. Sounds of beating and dusting came from the spare room. Tables and chairs were standing about, and a cot bed, which seemed to be taking a walk all by itself, had stopped short at the head of the stairs and barred the way. "Why, how queer!" said Katy, trying to get by. "What can be going to happen? Oh, there's Aunt Izzie. Aunt Izzie, who's coming? What are you moving the things out of the blue room for?" "Oh, gracious, is that you?" replied Aunt Izzie, who looked very hot and flurried. "Now, children, it's no use for you to stand there asking questions. I haven't got time to answer them. Let the bedstead alone, Katy. You'll push it into the wall. There, I told you so," as Katy gave an impatient shove. "You've made a bad mark on the paper. What a troublesome child you are. Go right downstairs, both of you, and don't come up this way again until after tea. I've just as much as I can possibly attend to till then." "Just tell us what's going to happen and we will," cried the children. "Your cousin Helen is coming to visit us," said Miss Izzie curtly, and disappeared into the blue room. This was news indeed. Katy and Clover ran downstairs in great excitement, and after consulting a little, retired to the loft to talk it over in peace and quiet. Cousin Helen coming! It seemed as strange as if Queen Victoria, gold crown and all, had invited herself to tea, or as if some character out of a book, Robinson Crusoe, say, or Amy Herbert, had driven up with a trunk and announced the intention of spending a week. For to the imaginations of the children, Cousin Helen was as interesting and unreal as anybody in the fairy tales, Cinderella or Bluebeard or dear Red Riding Hood herself. Only there was a sort of mixture of Sunday school book in their idea of her, for Cousin Helen was very, very good. None of them had ever seen her. Philly said he was sure she hadn't any legs, because she never went away from home, and lay on a sofa all the time. But the rest knew that this was because Cousin Helen was ill. Papa always went to visit her twice a year, and he liked to talk to the children about her, and tell how sweet and patient she was, and what a pretty room she lived in. Katy and Clover had played Cousin Helen so long that now they were frightened as well as glad at the idea of seeing the real one. "Do you suppose she will want us to say hymns to her all the time?" asked Clover. "Not all the time," replied Katy, "because you'll know she'll get tired and have to take naps in the afternoons. And then, of course, she reads the Bible a great deal. Oh, dear, how quiet we shall have to be. I wonder how long she's going to stay." "What do you suppose she looks like?" went on Clover. "Something like Lucy and Mrs. Sherwood, I guess, with blue eyes and curls and a long straight nose. And she'll keep her hands clasped so all the time, and wear frilled wrappers, and lie on the sofa perfectly still and never smile, and just look patient. We'll have to take off our boots in the hall, Clover, and go upstairs in stocking feet so as not to make a noise all the time she stays." "Won't it be funny?" giggled Clover, her sober little face growing bright at the idea of this variation on the hymns. The time seemed very long till the next afternoon, when Cousin Helen was expected. Aunt Izzie, who was in a great excitement, gave the children many orders about their behavior. They were to do this and that, and not to do the other. Dorry at last announced that he wished Cousin Helen would just stay at home. Clover and Elsie, who had been thinking pretty much the same thing in private, were glad to hear that she was on her way to a water cure and would only stay 4 days. 5 o'clock came. They all sat on the steps waiting for the carriage. At last it drove up. Papa was on the box. He motioned the children to stand back. Then he helped out a nice-looking young woman who, Aunt Izzie told them, was Cousin Helen's nurse, and then, very carefully, lifted Cousin Helen in his arms and brought her in. "Oh, there are the chicks," were the first words the children heard, in such a gay, pleasant voice. "Do set me down somewhere, Uncle. I want to see them so much." So Papa put Cousin Helen on the hall sofa. The nurse fetched a pillow, and when she was made comfortable, Dr. Carr called to the little ones. "Cousin Helen wants to see you," he said. "Indeed I do," said the bright voice. "So this is Katy. Why, what a splendid, tall Katy it is. And this is Clover," kissing her, "and this dear little Elsie. You all look as natural as possible, just as if I had seen you before." And she hugged them all round, not as if it was polite to like them because they were relations, but as if she had loved them and wanted them all her life. There was something in Cousin Helen's face and manner which made the children at home with her at once. Even Philly, who had backed away with his hands behind him after staring hard for a minute or two, came up with a sort of rush to get his share of kissing. Still, Katy's first feeling was one of disappointment. Cousin Helen was not at all like Lucy in Mrs. Sherwood's story. Her nose turned up the least bit in the world. She had brown hair, which didn't curl, a brown skin, and bright eyes, which danced when she laughed or spoke. Her face was thin, but except for that you wouldn't have guessed that she was sick. She didn't fold her hands, and she didn't look patient, but absolutely glad and merry. Her dress wasn't a frilled wrapper, but a sort of loose traveling thing of pretty gray stuff, with a rose-colored bow and bracelets and a round hat trimmed with a gray feather. All Katy's dreams about the saintly invalid seemed to take wings and fly away. But the more she watched Cousin Helen, the more she seemed to like her, and to feel as if she were nicer than the imaginary person which she and Clover had invented. "She looks just like other people, don't she?" whispered Cecy, who had come over to have a peep at the new arrival. "Yes," replied Katy doubtfully, "only a great deal prettier." By and by, Papa carried Cousin Helen upstairs. All the children wanted to go too, but he told them she was tired and must rest. So they went outdoors to play till tea time. "Oh, do let me take up the tray," cried Katy at the tea table as she watched Aunt Izzie getting ready Cousin Helen's supper. Such a nice supper. Cold chicken and raspberries and cream and tea in a pretty pink and white china cup. And such a snow-white napkin as Aunt Izzie spread over the tray. "No, indeed," said Aunt Izzie. "You'll drop it the first thing." But Katy's eyes begged so hard that Dr. Carr said, "Yes, let her, Izzie. I like to see the girls useful." So Katy, proud of the commission, took the tray and carried it carefully across the hall. There was a bowl of flowers on the table. As she passed, she was struck with a bright idea. She set down the tray and, picking out a rose, laid it on the napkin beside the saucer of crimson raspberries. It looked very pretty, and Katy smiled to herself with pleasure. "What are you stopping for?" called Aunt Izzie from the dining room. "Do be careful, Katy. I really think Bridget had better take it." "Oh, no, no," protested Katy. "I'm most up already." And she sped upstairs as fast as she could go. Luckless speed. She had just reached the door of the blue room when she tripped upon her bootlace, which, as usual, was dangling, made a misstep, and stumbled. She caught at the door to save herself. The door flew open, and Katy, with the tray, cream, raspberries, rose, and all, descended in a confused heap upon the carpet. "I told you so!" exclaimed Aunt Izzie from the bottom of the stairs. Katy never forgot how kind Cousin Helen was on this occasion. She was in bed, and was, of course, a good deal startled at the sudden crash and tumble on her floor. But after one little jump, nothing could have been sweeter than the way in which she comforted poor crestfallen Katy, and made so merry over the accident that even Aunt Izzie almost forgot to scold. The broken dishes were piled up and the carpet made clean again, while Aunt Izzie prepared another tray just as nice as the first. "Please let Katy bring it up," pleaded Cousin Helen in her pleasant voice. "I'm sure she will be careful this time. And Katy, I want just such another rose on the napkin. I guess that was your doing, wasn't it?" Katy was careful. This time all went well. The tray was placed safely on a little table beside the bed, and Katy sat watching Cousin Helen eat her supper with a warm, loving feeling at her heart. I think we are scarcely ever so grateful to people as when they help us to get back our own self-esteem. Cousin Helen hadn't much appetite, though she declared everything was delicious. Katy could see that she was very tired. "Now," she said when she had finished, "if you'll shake up this pillow, so, and move this other pillow a little, I think I will settle myself to sleep. Thanks, that's just right. Why, Katy dear, you are a born nurse. Now kiss me. Good night. Tomorrow we will have a nice talk." Katy went downstairs very happy. "Cousin Helen's perfectly lovely," she told Clover, "and she's got on the most beautiful nightgown, all lace and ruffles. It's just like a nightgown in a book." "Isn't it wicked to care about clothes when you're sick?" questioned Cecy. "I don't believe Cousin Helen could do anything wicked," said Katy. "I told Ma that she had on bracelets, and Ma said she feared your cousin was a worldly person," retorted Cecy, primming up her lips. Katy and Clover were quite distressed at this opinion. They talked about it while they were undressing. "I mean to ask Cousin Helen tomorrow," said Katy. Next morning the children got up very early. They were so glad that it was vacation. If it hadn't been, they would have been forced to go to school without seeing Cousin Helen, for she didn't wake up till late. They grew so impatient of the delay, and went upstairs so often to listen at the door and see if she were moving, that Aunt Izzie finally had to order them off. Katy rebelled against this order a good deal, but she consoled herself by going into the garden and picking the prettiest flowers she could find, to give to Cousin Helen the moment she should see her. When Aunt Izzie let her go up, Cousin Helen was lying on the sofa, all dressed for the day in a fresh blue muslin with blue ribbons and cunning bronze slippers with rosettes on the toes. The sofa had been wheeled round with its back to the light. There was a cushion with a pretty fluted cover that Katy had never seen before, and several other things were scattered about, which gave the room quite a different air. All the house was neat, but somehow Aunt Izzie's rooms were never pretty. Children's eyes are quick to perceive such things, and Katy saw at once that the blue room had never looked like this. Cousin Helen was white and tired, but her eyes and smile were as bright as ever. She was delighted with the flowers, which Katy presented rather shyly. "Oh, how lovely," she said. "I must put them in water right away. Katy dear, don't you want to bring that little vase on the bureau and set it on this chair beside me? And please pour a little water into it first." "What a beauty!" cried Katy, as she lifted the graceful white cup swung on a gilt stand. "Is it yours, Cousin Helen?" "Yes, it is my pet vase. It stands on a little table beside me at home, and I fancy that the water cure would seem more homelike if I had it with me there, so I brought it along. But why do you look so puzzled, Katy? Does it seem queer that a vase should travel about in a trunk?" "No," said Katy slowly. "I was only thinking, Cousin Helen, is it worldly to have pretty things when you're sick?" Cousin Helen laughed heartily. "What put that idea into your head?" she asked. "Cecy said so when I told her about your beautiful nightgown." Cousin Helen laughed again. "Well," she said, "I'll tell you what I think, Katy. Pretty things are no more worldly than ugly ones, except when they spoil us by making us vain or careless of the comfort of other people. And sickness is such a disagreeable thing in itself that unless sick people take great pains, they soon grow to be eyesores to themselves and everybody about them. I don't think it is possible for an invalid to be too particular. And when one has the backache and the headache and the all-over ache," she added, smiling, "there isn't much danger of growing vain because of a ruffle more or less on one's nightgown or a bit of bright ribbon." Then she began to arrange the flowers, touching each separate one gently as if she loved it. "What a queer noise!" she exclaimed, suddenly stopping. It was queer, a sort of snuffling and snorting sound, as if a walrus or a seahorse were promenading up and down in the hall. Katy opened the door. Behold, there were John and Dorry, very red in the face from flattening their noses against the keyhole in a vain attempt to see if Cousin Helen were up and ready to receive company. "Oh, let them come in," cried Cousin Helen from her sofa. So they came in, followed before long by Clover and Elsie. Such a merry morning as they had! Cousin Helen proved to possess a perfect genius for storytelling and for suggesting games which could be played about her sofa and did not make more noise than she could bear. Aunt Izzie, dropping in about 11 o'clock, found them having such a good time that almost before she knew it she was drawn into the game too. Nobody had ever heard of such a thing before. There sat Aunt Izzie on the floor with 3 long lamplighters stuck in her hair, playing "I'm a genteel lady, always genteel" in the jolliest manner possible. The children were so enchanted at the spectacle that they could hardly attend to the game, and were always forgetting how many horns they had. Clover privately thought that Cousin Helen must be a witch, and Papa, when he came home at noon, said almost the same thing. "What have you been doing to them, Helen?" he inquired as he opened the door and saw the merry circle on the carpet. Aunt Izzie's hair was half pulled down, and Philly was rolling over and over in convulsions of laughter. But Cousin Helen said she hadn't done anything, and pretty soon Papa was on the floor too, playing away as fast as the rest. "I must put a stop to this," he cried, when everybody was tired of laughing and everybody's head was stuck as full of paper quills as a porcupine's back. "Cousin Helen will be worn out. Run away, all of you, and don't come near this door again till the clock strikes 4. Do you hear, chicks? Run, run! Shoo, shoo!" The children scuttled away like a brood of fowls, all but Katy. "Oh, Papa, I'll be so quiet," she pleaded. "Mightn't I stay just till the dinner bell rings?" "Do let her," said Cousin Helen. So Papa said yes. Katy sat on the floor, holding Cousin Helen's hand and listening to her talk with Papa. It interested her, though it was about things and people she did not know. "How is Alex?" asked Dr. Carr at length. "Quite well now," replied Cousin Helen with one of her brightest looks. "He was run down and tired in the spring, and we were a little anxious about him, but Emma persuaded him to take a fortnight's vacation, and he came back all right." "Do you see them often?" "Almost every day. And little Helen comes every day, you know, for her lessons." "Is she as pretty as she used to be?" "Oh, yes, prettier, I think. She is a lovely little creature. Having her so much with me is one of my greatest treats. Alex tries to think that she looks a little as I used to, but that is a compliment so great that I dare not appropriate it." Dr. Carr stooped and kissed Cousin Helen as if he could not help it. "My dear child," he said. That was all. But something in the tone made Katy curious. "Papa," she said after dinner, "who is Alex that you and Cousin Helen were talking about?" "Why, Katy? What makes you want to know?" "I can't exactly tell, only Cousin Helen looked so, and you kissed her, and I thought perhaps it was something interesting." "So it is," said Dr. Carr, drawing her onto his knee. "I've a mind to tell you about it, Katy, because you're old enough to see how beautiful it is, and wise enough, I hope, not to chatter or ask questions. Alex is the name of somebody who, long ago, when Cousin Helen was well and strong, she loved and expected to marry." "Oh, why didn't she?" cried Katy. "She met with a dreadful accident," continued Dr. Carr. "For a long time they thought she would die. Then she grew slowly better, and the doctors told her that she might live a good many years, but that she would have to lie on her sofa always, and be helpless and a cripple." Alex felt dreadfully when he heard this. He wanted to marry Cousin Helen just the same, and be her nurse, and take care of her always, but she would not consent. She broke the engagement, and told him that some day she hoped he would love somebody else well enough to marry her. So after a good many years he did, and now he and his wife live next door to Cousin Helen and are her dearest friends. Their little girl is named Helen. All their plans are talked over with her, and there is nobody in the world they think so much of." "But doesn't it make Cousin Helen feel bad when she sees them walking about and enjoying themselves and she can't move?" asked Katy. "No," said Dr. Carr, "it doesn't, because Cousin Helen is half an angel already and loves people better than herself. I'm very glad she could come here for once. She's an example to us all, Katy, and I couldn't ask anything better than to have my little girls take pattern after her." "It must be awful to be sick," soliloquized Katy after Papa was gone. "Why, if I had to stay in bed a whole week I should die. I know I should." Poor Katy. It seemed to her, as it does to almost all young people, that there is nothing in the world so easy as to die the moment things go wrong. This conversation with Papa made Cousin Helen doubly interesting in Katy's eyes. It was just like something in a book to be in the same house with the heroine of a love story so sad and sweet. The play that afternoon was much interrupted, for every few minutes somebody had to run in and see if it wasn't 4 o'clock. The instant the hour came, all 6 children galloped up the stairs. "I think we'll tell stories this time," said Cousin Helen. So they told stories. Cousin Helen's were the best of all. There was one of them about a robber, which sent delightful chills creeping down all their backs. All but Philly. He was so excited that he grew warlike.
"I ain't afraid of robbers," he declared, strutting up and down. "When they come, I shall just cut them in two with my sword which Papa gave me. They did come once. I did cut them in two. 3, 5, 11 of 'em. You'll see."
But that evening, after the younger children were gone to bed and Katy and Clover were sitting in the blue room, a lamentable howling was heard from the nursery. Clover ran to see what was the matter. Behold, there was Phil sitting up in bed and crying for help.
"There's robbers under the bed," he sobbed. "Ever so many robbers."
"Why, no, Philly," said Clover, peeping under the valance to satisfy him. "There isn't anybody there."
"Yes, there is, I tell you," declared Phil, holding her tight. "I heard one. They were chewing my India rubbers."
"Poor little fellow," said Cousin Helen, when Clover, having pacified Phil, came back to report. "It's a warning against robber stories. But this one ended so well that I didn't think of anybody's being frightened." It was no use, after this, for Aunt Izzie to make rules about going into the blue room. She might as well have ordered flies to keep away from a sugar bowl. By hook or by crook, the children would get upstairs. Whenever Aunt Izzie went in, she was sure to find them there, just as close to Cousin Helen as they could get. And Cousin Helen begged her not to interfere. "We have only 3 or 4 days to be together," she said. "Let them come as much as they like. It won't hurt me a bit." Little Elsie clung with a passionate love to this new friend. Cousin Helen had sharp eyes. She saw the wistful look in Elsie's face at once, and took special pains to be sweet and tender to her. This preference made Katy jealous. She couldn't bear to share her cousin with anybody. When the last evening came and they went up after tea to the blue room, Cousin Helen was opening a box which had just come by express. "It is a good-bye box," she said. "All of you must sit down in a row, and when I hide my hands beside me so, you must choose in turn which you will take." So they all chose in turn. "Which hand will you have, the right or the left?" And Cousin Helen, with the air of a wise fairy, brought out from behind her pillow something pretty for each one. First came a vase exactly like her own, which Katy had admired so much. Katy screamed with delight as it was placed in her hands. "Oh, how lovely! How lovely!" she cried. "I'll keep it as long as I live and breathe." "If you do, it'll be the first time you ever kept anything for a week without breaking it," remarked Aunt Izzie. Next came a pretty purple pocketbook for Clover. It was just what she wanted, for she had lost her portemonnaie. Then a cunning little locket on a bit of velvet ribbon, which Cousin Helen tied round Elsie's neck. "There's a piece of my hair in it," she said. "Why, Elsie, darling, what's the matter? Don't cry so."
"Oh, you're so beautiful and so sweet," sobbed Elsie, "and you're going away."
Dorry had a box of dominoes and John a solitaire board. For Phil there appeared a book, The History of the Robber Cat. "That will remind you of the night when the thieves came and chewed your India rubbers," said Cousin Helen with a mischievous smile. They all laughed, Phil loudest of all. Nobody was forgotten. There was a notebook for Papa, and a set of ivory tablets for Aunt Izzie. Even Cecy was remembered. Her present was The Book of Golden Deeds, with all sorts of stories about boys and girls who had done brave and good things. She was almost too pleased to speak. "Oh, thank you, Cousin Helen," she said at last. Cecy wasn't a cousin, but she and the Carr children were in the habit of sharing their aunts and uncles and relations generally, as they did other good things. Next day came the sad parting. All the little ones stood at the gate to wave their pocket-handkerchiefs as the carriage drove away. When it was quite out of sight, Katy rushed off to weep a little weep, all by herself. "Papa said he wished we were all like Cousin Helen," she thought as she wiped her eyes, "and I mean to try, though I don't suppose if I tried 1,000 years I should ever get to be half so good. I'll study and keep my things in order and be ever so kind to the little ones. Dear me, if only Aunt Izzie was Cousin Helen, how easy it would be. Never mind. I'll think about her all the time, and I'll begin tomorrow." End of Chapter 7. Afraid of What Katy Did by Susan Coolidge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. Chapter 8. Tomorrow. "Tomorrow I will begin," thought Katy as she dropped asleep that night. How often we all do so. And what a pity it is that when morning comes, and tomorrow is today, we so frequently wake up feeling quite differently, careless or impatient, and not a bit inclined to do the fine things we planned overnight. Sometimes it seems as if there must be wicked little imps in the world who are kept tied up so long as the sun shines, but who creep into our bedrooms when we are asleep to tease us and ruffle our tempers. Else why, when we go to rest good-natured and pleasant, should we wake up so cross? Now there was Katy. Her last sleepy thought was an intention to be an angel from that time on, and as much like Cousin Helen as she could. And when she opened her eyes she was all out of sorts and as fractious as a bear. Old Mary said that she got out of bed on the wrong side. I wonder, by the way, if anybody will ever be wise enough to tell us which side that is, so that we may always choose the other. How comfortable it would be if they could. You know how, if we begin the day in a cross mood, all sorts of unfortunate accidents seem to occur to add to our vexations. The very first thing Katy did this morning was to break her precious vase, the one Cousin Helen had given her. It was standing on the bureau with a little cluster of blush roses in it. The bureau had a swing-glass. While Katy was brushing her hair, the glass tipped a little so that she could not see. At a good-humored moment this accident wouldn't have troubled her much, but being out of temper to begin with, it made her angry. She gave the glass a violent push. The lower part swung forward, there was a smash, and the first thing Katy knew, the blush roses lay scattered all over the floor, and Cousin Helen's pretty present was ruined. Katy just sat down on the carpet and cried as hard as if she had been Phil himself. Aunt Izzie heard her lamenting and came in. "I'm very sorry," she said, picking up the broken glass, "but it's no more than I expected. You're so careless, Katy. Now don't sit there in that foolish way. Get up and dress yourself. You'll be late to breakfast." "What's the matter?" asked Papa, noticing Katy's red eyes as she took her seat at the table. "I've broken my vase," said Katy dolefully. "It was extremely careless of you to put it in such a dangerous place," said her aunt. "You might have known that the glass would swing out and knock it off." Then, seeing a big tear fall in the middle of Katy's plate, she added, "Really, Katy, you're too big to behave like a baby. Why, Dorry would be ashamed to do so. Pray control yourself." This snub did not improve Katy's temper. She went on with her breakfast in sulky silence. "What are you all going to do today?" asked Dr. Carr, hoping to give things a more cheerful turn. "Swing!" cried John and Dorry both together. "Alexander's put us up a splendid one in the woodshed." "No, you're not," said Aunt Izzie in a positive tone. "The swing is not to be used till tomorrow. Remember that, children. Not till tomorrow, and not then unless I give you leave." This was unwise of Aunt Izzie. She would better have explained farther. The truth was that Alexander, in putting up the swing, had cracked one of the staples which fastened it to the roof. He meant to get a new one in the course of the day, and meantime he had cautioned Miss Carr to let no one use the swing, because it really was not safe. If she had told this to the children, all would have been right. But Aunt Izzie's theory was that young people must obey their elders without explanation. John and Elsie and Dorry all pouted when they heard this order. Elsie recovered her good humor first. "I don't care," she said, "'cause I'm going to be very busy. I've got to write a letter to Cousin Helen about something." Elsie never could quite pronounce the th. "What?" asked Clover. "Oh, something," answered Elsie, wagging her head mysteriously. "None of the rest of you must know. Cousin Helen said so. It's a secret she and me has got." "I don't believe Cousin Helen said so at all," said Katy crossly. "She wouldn't tell secrets to a silly little girl like you." "Yes, she would, too," retorted Elsie angrily. "She said I was just as good to trust as if I was ever so big, and she said I was her pet. So there, Katy Carr." "Stop disputing," said Aunt Izzie. "Katy, your top drawer is all out of order. I never saw anything look so badly. Go upstairs at once and straighten it before you do anything else. Children, you must keep in the shade this morning. It's too hot for you to be running about in the sun. Elsie, go into the kitchen and tell Debbie I want to speak to her." "Yes," said Elsie in an important tone, "and afterwards I'm coming back to write my letter to Cousin Helen." Katy went slowly upstairs, dragging one foot after the other. It was a warm, languid day. Her head ached a little, and her eyes smarted and felt heavy from crying so much. Everything seemed dull and hateful. She said to herself that Aunt Izzie was very unkind to make her work in vacation, and she pulled the top drawer open with a disgusted groan. It must be confessed that Miss Izzie was right. A bureau drawer could hardly look worse than this one did. It reminded one of the White Knight's recipe for a pudding, which began with blotting paper and ended with sealing wax and gunpowder. All sorts of things were mixed together, as if somebody had put in a long stick and stirred them well up. There were books and paint-boxes and bits of scribbled paper and lead pencils and brushes. Stocking legs had come unrolled and twisted themselves about pocket handkerchiefs and ends of ribbon and linen collars. Ruffles, all crushed out of shape, stuck up from under the heavier things, and sundry little paper boxes lay empty on top, the treasures they once held having sifted down to the bottom of the drawer and disappeared beneath the general mass. It took much time and patience to bring order out of this confusion, but Katy knew that Aunt Izzie would be up by and by, and she dared not stop till all was done. By the time it was finished, she was very tired. Going downstairs, she met Elsie coming up with a slate in her hand, which, as soon as she saw Katy, she put behind her. "You mustn't look," she said. "It's my letter to Cousin Helen. Nobody but me knows the secret. It's all written, and I'm going to send it to the office. See, there's a stamp on it." And she exhibited a corner of the slate. Sure enough, there was a stamp stuck on the frame. "You little goose," said Katy impatiently. "You can't send that to the post office. Here, give me the slate. I'll copy what you've written on paper, and Papa'll give you an envelope." "No, no," cried Elsie, struggling. "You mustn't. You'll see what I've said, and Cousin Helen said I wasn't to tell. It's a secret. Let go of my slate, I say. I'll tell Cousin Helen what a mean girl you are, and then she won't love you a bit." "There, then, take your old slate," said Katy, giving her a vindictive push. Elsie slipped, screamed, caught at the banisters, missed them, and rolling over and over, fell with a thump on the hall floor. It wasn't much of a fall, only half a dozen steps, but the bump was a hard one, and Elsie roared as if she had been half killed. Aunt Izzie and Mary came rushing to the spot. "Katy pushed me," sobbed Elsie. "She wanted me to tell her my secret, and I wouldn't. She's a bad, naughty girl." "Well, Katy Carr, I should think you'd be ashamed of yourself," said Aunt Izzie, "wreaking your temper on your poor little sister. I think your Cousin Helen will be surprised when she hears this. There, there, Elsie, don't cry any more, dear. Come upstairs with me, and I'll put on some arnica, and Katy shan't hurt you again." So they went upstairs. Katy, left below, felt very miserable, repentant, defiant, discontented, and sulky all at once. She knew in her heart that she had not meant to hurt Elsie, but was thoroughly ashamed of that push. But Aunt Izzie's hint about telling Cousin Helen had made her too angry to allow of her confessing this to herself or anybody else. "I don't care," she murmured, choking back her tears. "Elsie is a real crybaby anyway, and Aunt Izzie always takes her part, just because I told the little silly not to go and send a great heavy slate to the post office." She went out by the side door into the yard. As she passed the shed, the new swing caught her eye. How exactly like Aunt Izzie, she thought, ordering the children not to swing till she gives them leave. I suppose she thinks it's too hot or something. I shan't mind her anyhow. She seated herself in the swing. It was a first-rate one, with a broad, comfortable seat and thick new ropes. The seat hung just the right distance from the floor. Alexander was a capital hand at putting up swings, and the woodshed the nicest possible spot in which to have one. It was a big place with a very high roof. There was not much wood left in it just now, and the little there was piled neatly about the sides of the shed, so as to leave plenty of room. The place felt cool and dark, and the motion of the swing seemed to set the breeze blowing. It waved Katy's hair like a great fan, and made her dreamy and quiet. All sorts of sleepy ideas began to flit through her brain. Swinging to and fro like the pendulum of a great clock, she gradually rose higher and higher, driving herself along by the motion of her body and striking the floor smartly with her foot at every sweep. Now she was at the top of the high arched door. Then she could almost touch the crossbeam above it, and through the small square window could see pigeons sitting and pluming themselves on the eaves of the barn, and white clouds blowing over the blue sky. She had never swung so high before. It was like flying, she thought, and she bent and curved more strongly in the seat, trying to send herself yet higher and graze the roof with her toes. Suddenly, at the very highest point of the sweep, there was a sharp noise of cracking. The swing gave a violent twist, spun half round, and tossed Katy into the air. She clutched the rope, felt it dragged from her grasp, then down, down, down she fell. All grew dark, and she knew no more. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the sofa in the dining-room. Clover was kneeling beside her with a pale, scared face, and Aunt Izzie was dropping something cold and wet on her forehead. "What's the matter?" said Katy faintly. "Oh, she's alive! She's alive!" And Clover put her arms around Katy's neck and sobbed. "Hush, dear." Aunt Izzie's voice sounded unusually gentle. "You've had a bad tumble, Katy. Don't you recollect?" A tumble? Oh, yes, out of the swing," said Katy, as it all came slowly back to her. "Did the rope break, Aunt Izzie? I can't remember about it." "No, Katy, not the rope. The staple drew out of the roof. It was a cracked one and not safe. Don't you recollect my telling you not to swing today? Did you forget?" "No, Aunt Izzie, I didn't forget. But here Katy broke down. She closed her eyes, and big tears rolled from under the lids. "Don't cry," whispered Clover, crying herself. "Please don't. Aunt Izzie isn't going to scold you." But Katy was too weak and shaken not to cry. "I think I'd like to go upstairs and lie on the bed," she said. But when she tried to get off the sofa, everything swam before her, and she fell back again on the pillow. "Oh, I can't stand up," she gasped, looking very much frightened. "I'm afraid you've given yourself a sprain somewhere," said Aunt Izzie, who looked rather frightened herself. "You'd better lie still a while, dear, before you try to move. Ah, here's the doctor. Well, I am glad." And she went forward to meet him. It wasn't Papa, but Dr. Alsop, who lived quite near them. "I'm so relieved that you could come," Aunt Izzie said. "My brother has gone out of town, not to return till tomorrow, and one of the little girls has had a bad fall." Dr. Alsop sat down beside the sofa and counted Katy's pulse. Then he began feeling all over her. "Can you move this leg?" he asked. Katy gave a feeble kick. "And this?" The kick was a good deal more feeble. "Did that hurt you?" asked Dr. Alsop, seeing a look of pain on her face. "Yes, a little," replied Katy, trying hard not to cry. "In your back, eh? Was the pain high up or low down?" And the doctor punched Katy's spine for some minutes, making her squirm uneasily. "I'm afraid she's done some mischief," he said at last. "But it's impossible to tell yet exactly what. It may be only a twist or a slight sprain," he added, seeing the look of terror on Katy's face. "You'd better get her upstairs and undress her as soon as you can, Miss Carr. I'll leave a prescription to rub her with." And Dr. Alsop took out a bit of paper and began to write. "Oh, must I go to bed?" said Katy. "How long will I have to stay there, doctor?" "That depends on how fast you get well," replied the doctor. "Not long, I hope. Perhaps only a few days." "A few days?" repeated Katy in a despairing tone. After the doctor was gone, Aunt Izzie and Debbie lifted Katy and carried her slowly upstairs. It was not easy, for every motion hurt her, and the sense of being helpless hurt most of all. She couldn't help crying after she was undressed and put into bed. It all seemed so dreadful and strange. If only Papa was here, she thought. But Dr. Carr had gone into the country to see somebody who was very sick and couldn't possibly be back till tomorrow. Such a long, long afternoon as that was. Aunt Izzie sent up some dinner, but Katy couldn't eat. Her lips were parched and her head ached violently. The sun began to pour in, the room grew warm. Flies buzzed in the window and tormented her by lighting on her face. Little prickles of pain ran up and down her back. She lay with her eyes shut because it hurt to keep them open, and all sorts of uneasy thoughts went rushing through her mind. "Perhaps, if my back is really sprained, I shall have to lie here as much as a week," she said to herself. "Oh, dear, dear, I can't. The vacation is only 8 weeks, and I was going to do such lovely things. How can people be as patient as Cousin Helen when they have to lie still? Won't she be sorry when she hears? Was it really yesterday that she went away?
It seems a year. If only I hadn't got into that nasty old swing."
And then Katy began to imagine how it would have been if she hadn't, and how she and Clover had meant to go to Paradise that afternoon. They might have been there under the cool trees now. As these thoughts ran through her mind, her head grew hotter and her position in the bed more uncomfortable. Suddenly she became conscious that the glaring light from the window was shaded, and that the wind seemed to be blowing freshly over her. She opened her heavy eyes. The blinds were shut, and there beside the bed sat little Elsie, fanning her with a palm-leaf fan. "Did I wake you up, Katy?" she asked in a timid voice. Katy looked at her with startled, amazed eyes. "Don't be frightened," said Elsie. "I won't disturb you. Johnny and me are so sorry you're sick," and her little lips trembled. "But we mean to keep real quiet and never bang the nursery door or make noises on the stairs till you're well again. And I've brought you something real nice. Some of it's from John and some from me. It's because you got tumbled out of the swing. See?" And Elsie pointed triumphantly to a chair which she had pulled up close to the bed, and on which were solemnly set forth, first, a pewter tea set; second, a box with a glass lid, on which flowers were painted; third, a jointed doll; fourth, a transparent slate; and lastly, 2 new lead pencils. "They're all yours to keep," said generous little Elsie. "You can have Pickery too if you want, only he's pretty big and I'm afraid he'd be lonely without me. Don't you like the things, Katy? They're real pretty." It seemed to Katy as if the hottest sort of a coal of fire was burning into the top of her head as she looked at the treasures on the chair and then at Elsie's face, all lighted up with affectionate self-sacrifice. She tried to speak, but began to cry instead, which frightened Elsie very much. "Does it hurt you so bad?" she asked, crying too from sympathy. "Oh, no, it isn't that," sobbed Katy. "But I was so cross to you this morning, Elsie, and pushed you. Oh, please forgive me, please do." "Why, it's got well," said Elsie, surprised. "Aunt Izzie put a thing out of a bottle on it, and the bump all went away. Shall I go and ask her to put some on you too? I will." And she ran toward the door. "Oh, no," cried Katy. "Don't go away, Elsie. Come here and kiss me instead." Elsie turned as if doubtful whether this invitation could be meant for her. Katy held out her arms. Elsie ran right into them, and the big sister and the little exchanged an embrace which seemed to bring their hearts closer together than they had ever been before. "You're the most precious little darling," murmured Katy, clasping Elsie tight. "I've been real horrid to you, Elsie, but I'll never be again. You shall play with me and Clover and Cecy just as much as you like, and write notes in all the post offices and everything else." "Oh, goody, goody!" cried Elsie, executing little skips of transport. "How sweet you are, Katy! I mean to love you next best to Cousin Helen and Papa. And," racking her brains for some way of repaying this wonderful kindness, "I'll tell you the secret if you want me to very much. I guess Cousin Helen would let me." "No," said Katy. "Never mind about the secret. I don't want you to tell it to me. Sit down by the bed and fan me some more instead." "No," persisted Elsie, who, now that she had made up her mind to part with the treasured secret, could not bear to be stopped. "Cousin Helen gave me $50 and told me to give it to Debbie and tell her she was much obliged to her for making her such nice things to eat, and I did, and Debbie was real pleased. And I wrote Cousin Helen a letter and told her that Debbie liked the $50. That's the secret. Isn't it a nice one? Only you mustn't tell anybody about it ever, just as long as you live." "No," said Katy, smiling faintly. "I won't." All the rest of the afternoon Elsie sat beside the bed with her palm-leaf fan, keeping off the flies and shooing away the other children when they peeped in at the door. "Do you really like to have me here?" she asked more than once, and smiled oh so triumphantly when Katy said yes. But though Katy said yes, I am afraid it was only half the truth, for the sight of the dear little forgiving girl whom she had treated unkindly gave her more pain than pleasure. "I'll be so good to her when I get well," she thought to herself, tossing uneasily to and fro. Aunt Izzie slept in her room that night. Katy was feverish. When morning came and Dr. Carr returned, he found her in a good deal of pain, hot and restless, with wide-open, anxious eyes. "Papa," she cried the first thing, "must I lie here as much as a week?" "My darling, I'm afraid you must," replied her father, who looked worried and very grave. "Dear, dear," sobbed Katy, "how can I bear it?" Chapter 9